I was in no rush to embrace a religion, which would have meant alienating most of my friends, and it did. And I lost some very close, good friends of mine who, the moment I said my Shahada, refused to ever speak to me again. And that was quite hurtful. And I mean, they wouldn't talk about it. It was not like we had an argument and a row. They just, they were so appalled by what I did that they refused to speak to me ever again. So, and I suspected something like that would happen because some of my Christian friends, were quite Islamophobic as well. I crossed over to the enemy camp, so to speak, in their point of view. So, ultimately, I did say the Shahada, and Islam answered many of the profound problems I had within Christianity. Islam had the answers to them, which is, again, amazing. I didn't expect any other religion to actually have answers to the problems, like problem of evil. Islam has the problem of suffering, has real answers, which Christianity unfortunately doesn't have.
Assalamu alaikum all. And I think there's one way I can start this podcast, and that's by saying today I am delighted to be joined by Brother Paul Williams. You're most welcome, sir.
Oh dear, cliche. That's very good. Thank you so much for inviting me on. I recognize the copyrighted terms you've just made, so I'll be suing you. But no, it's wonderful. Thanks for having me on.
It's a great honor to have you on this podcast. On this podcast, I like to interview inspirational Muslims and find out more about their background and also their personalities so that it can be a means of inspiration for other Muslims, especially young Muslims. So take me back to, say, if I was one of your high school friends, let's say, how would they describe you, or how were you at a young age in terms of your personality, and how would you describe yourself?
Gosh, I didn't realize this would be a psychoanalytic session. So how would they be? Okay. At school, I was a bit of a failure, actually, academically. I didn't like school much at all. There are a few exceptions, but most of my reading and my studying I just did privately, and I was intensively interested in studying philosophy and history, politics, and so on. But that had no relevance at all to what I was doing at school, where I was a bit of a failure. So I think my schoolmates would have seen me as a relatively unintelligent dullard who I didn't have much of a future, I suspect. And I'm not saying they were wrong either, but it didn't really reflect what was going on the rest of my life privately. There was a disconnect between the two. So this is a very psychoanalytical subject, and but no, that's how I perceive it anyway.
No, that's great. So you were always into, it's interesting to note that you were always into reading and philosophy. So that's been a long-standing interest of yours, and it's obviously translated into the work that you do now.
Yeah.
Okay. Can you take me through your journey into religious beliefs, in terms of where you started and all the way up to embracing Islam?
Yeah. I mean, apologies in advance. It's not an interesting story. So I remember, I think I was 22, 21, cycling back from a party one Sunday morning, a party in South London where I lived. And I was an atheist at that time. And I was going up a street in Islington, and I saw a very beautiful building. It was a lovely day, Sunday morning, and it was a church, St. Mary's Church, Church of England, beautiful kind of classical building. So I actually went inside just to have a look around. And I remember having I don't remember there was a service going on. I don't know. I can't remember. But I remember having a very powerful experience of what I understood to be God's love, but it was a very external force that kind of impacted from me from outside. It wasn't something that came from within my heart or in my own being. And it was so powerful that I actually didn't like it. It was too much. And I actually just literally ran out of the building. But it was quite unexpected and quite shocking in a way. And I didn't know what to do with this experience because I wasn't a Christian. I wasn't a believer at all. I was an atheist, as I say. But it seemed to be at least a possible experience of God's love coming quite powerfully in my direction. So, of course, I went back there the following Sunday hoping for a repeat performance, and nothing happened, of course. And I think it was an experience, a spiritual experience, an authentic one, I think. But it set me on a spiritual journey. And because of my upbringing as a I didn't have a Christian upbringing, but in my school, it was a Christian school, I suppose, nominally Christian. That was the only kind of spiritual path that I related to and understood. So I eventually went to my local church. And after a couple of years of thinking and reading the Bible and stuff, I did become a Christian in the evangelical tradition. There's a great emphasis on God's love and fellowship and spiritual experience. So that kind of nicely fit in with my own spiritual awakening. But and that was great, but it was problematic because at the same time, because I've always been an avid reader, I of course started to read the Bible, which I had no knowledge of. So, and that was great. And some of it was really inspiring and moving. And I encountered it as God's word to me, the Bible. But there were other bits of the Bible which disturbed me and raised questions, awkward questions, about, who was Jesus and so on. And that set me on a new journey of looking for answers, which inevitably I went to books for. I did go to my pastor for answers. I didn't really get any answers, unfortunately, and that was a bit worrying. And so I went to biblical commentaries and other things, and I became aware of a whole world called biblical scholarship, which raised yet more questions, which I didn't even know were issues. Just example, the reliability or the unreliability of the Gospels, for example, particularly the Gospel of John. And this ended up me having quite a schizophrenic experience of being a Christian. On the one hand, I was a committed Christian. I believed that Jesus was Lord, and I had a born again experience. I can date it. I can tell you when I became a born again Christian. I went to church on Sundays, and I prayed every day and read the Bible, etc. And I believed that Jesus was God, and I believed in the Trinity. I believed the Bible was the inspired word of God, etc. But on the other hand, I was aware of these quite difficult questions, which called into doubt some of these beliefs in quite serious ways. And these issues ultimately led to me being quite, I used to see myself as kind of a disabled Christian. It was like I couldn't function properly. Yes, I was a Christian, but I couldn't walk in a very confident way anymore. I was kind of, um, and the Islam came on the scene when, after some years of being a Christian, and ultimately I became a Catholic. Actually, when I was at university studying Christian theology, for various reasons, I embraced Catholicism. And one of my tutors in patristics, who's now sadly passed away, received me into the Catholic Church in Mayfair. But a year or so after that, I was becoming quite Islamophobic for a whole bunch of reasons to do with where I'm living. And I decided to just go to my local mosque to learn more about Islam. And that mosque was Regent's Park Mosque, which is probably the most famous mosque in London, probably. And this is my local one. And there, with no intention of converting, of course, it was, why would I convert to Islam? I was a Christian. But I discovered something I'd never really experienced before, and that is real Islam from actual Muslims who knew the faith. And so I read the Quran in English, translation from cover to cover. I argued with some of them, about who Jesus was, because I was a Christian. But then I discovered there were other ways of understanding God, other ways of understanding Jesus, and also a fantastically rich spiritual tradition in Islam, which at the very least is equally deep and amazing and rich and profound and attractive as anything I'd found in Christianity. So, in Christianity, we have St. John of the Cross, we have the works of St. Augustine, we have the Imitation of Christ by Thomas à Kempis, St. Augustine's books, Confession, we have the Cloud of Unknowing, Julian of Norwich. I was going through a list of famous mystics, if you like, in the Christian tradition, and many, many more, which I'd read. But to find a parallel tradition to that in Islam was remarkable. Why? Because I believe that only through Christianity or through Jesus was there authentic, real Christianity. All the other religions are based on works, righteousness, and all this false stuff I've been told about other religions. Because it's not true, obviously, about Islam. So and then the jewel in this, the thing I really didn't expect to find, the jewel in Islam for me then, and still is in some ways, is this man called Muhammad,
So,
upon him be
so
peace. To actually learn about this most extraordinary of human beings was a real stunning revelation. I thought, wow, why haven't I been told about him before? And so I read Martin Lings's celebrated Seerah, its biography in English, which I really
yeah.
recommend. And that was an astonishing eye opener. And of course, then I had this dilemma. Okay, if Jesus was sent by God, which obviously I did believe as a Christian, Muhammad, he had all the characteristics of an authentic messenger, prophet of God. His life, his teaching, his personality, his integrity, his sheer amazingness. By what right did I have to affirm the former and not the latter as sent by God? And this was the dilemma. So I came to the conclusion, actually, they're both sent by God. I know it sounds obvious to Muslims, but to me, it was a difficult path to tread and to actually come to that point. Because Islam is associated with, as I thought, Arabs, the Middle East. It's not British, it's not English, all these kind of cultural baggage that I had. And so it wasn't just a simple intellectual exercise. If I accept that Muhammad was a prophet of God, that had consequences for my life. And boy, did it have consequences for my life. So ultimately, I did say the Shahada. And Islam answered many of the profound problems I had within Christianity. Islam had the answers to them, which is, again, amazing. I didn't expect any other religion to actually have answers to the problems. Like problem of evil, Islam has the problem of suffering has real answers, which Christianity unfortunately doesn't have. And I don't say that with any. I wish Christianity would take these answers and just use them, but it doesn't. It just ignores them. So, I mean, that's kind of a very short, uninteresting explanation of how I got to saying the Shahada. There were no miraculous events. It was a process that took a lot of time.
No, that's very interesting. So a couple of follow-up questions from that is, it's interesting to note that you describe yourself that you had some Islamophobic, let's say, tendencies, because that story mirrors other guests that you've had on your podcast, like the Dutch politician and others that seem to go from this extreme of hating Islam to loving Islam in a sense. And then there's also normally, I think Sheikh Hamza Yusuf story about his kind of interaction of religion was a near-death experience. But oftentimes, I did put a post up on my YouTube community asking what questions people would like you to answer. And one that's somewhat related to this was there was Brother Yusuf who asked, many Christians now base their belief on encounters with the Lord or visions. What do you think they mean by that? And I think you've kind of explained that. I think it's hard to explain. But I've also experienced a lot of Christians, they do seem to have a belief based on a very personal kind of experience. So I don't know what you'd like to add to that, if anything.
No, I think that's right. That is a distinctive feature of much of Christianity, is that what makes it true and authentic for the believer is spiritual experiences. So for the Muslim, it may be a belief, a certainty that God exists and that the Quran is from God and so on. But they might be true for some Sufis. Al-Ghazali famously, of course, achieved certainty of faith by having an experience, a religious experience. And I'm not knocking that, but for most Christians, this is a thing that really they had this. I mean, I've met very committed Christian missionaries who will say to me in all seriousness, and some of these people are very intelligent people. I will mention their names, but will say to me in all seriousness, well, I'm a Christian because I had a dream. I went to bed, I had a dream, and they tell me about this fairly obscure dream, which kind of doesn't really make much sense to me. And you say, yeah, but this means that Jesus is real and died for my sins. And therefore, I'm now a Christian because of this. And I can dedicate my life to this religion. And I'm thinking, I'm so underwhelmed by what you've just said. And it would be nice if it was more substantial, something I could really get my head around. But it's not. It's very subjective, and it's based on this experience. And which often you had a dream. I mean, I mean, I wouldn't base my life on dreams, the decisions in my waking life on dreams that I have, unless they were really, really exceptional. I'm not having exceptional dreams like that ever. I don't think. So but this is characteristic of a lot of Christianity, whereas Islam and the Quran itself invites one to reflect and to think, to use your mind, to reason, look at the ayat, the signs of God in the universe, to come to a conclusion, to waken your fitra, to, to remind us, it's not a new thing, to remind us of the existence of God, a creator, and to reflect on the afterlife and the day of judgment and so on. It's quite rooted in actual substantial realities. So yeah, there is that difference.
Mm,
I got to say, there are a lot of Christians are not like how I've described it. Some are much more intellectually orientated, and some have never had any experiences and just go out of because our forefathers did it and my parents did
mm,
it and I'm brought up in a Christian, therefore I'm going to do it. Um, so they're not all like that, but a really big number are, and it seems to be quite typical. You ask them, why are you a Christian? Ah, well, 20 years ago, I was sitting in a field and I had this amazing vision. Okay. And that's why you're a Christian. Okay.
mm.
You won't find, I don't find Muslims talking like that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think just reflecting on the recent interview that Jordan Peterson had with the Sapiens Institute, and I was just
Yeah.
thinking, perhaps if he had a similar story of personal experience, it would have been easier for him to navigate at least that discussion. But because he was coming at
Mm.
it from like the rational perspective, he was
Yeah.
just he was left in that position of just saying that um, he didn't really have that answer, or he didn't have something to rely on. So yeah, how you went on what seems like you were always interested in books, and you went on like an intellectual journey. How long would you
Mm.
describe that period of kind of wrestling with Islam, going back and forth before actually accepting it? So the moment you walked in,
About a year and a half, I think it
okay,
was, about a year and a half. It was quite a long
mm.
time, actually.
And
I mean, I was in no rush to embrace a religion, which would have meant alienating most of my friends, and it did. And I lost some very close, good friends of mine who, the moment I said my Shahada, refused to ever speak to me again.
mm,
And that was quite hurtful. And I mean, they wouldn't talk about it. It was not like we had an argument and a row. They just, they were so appalled by what I did that they refused to speak to me ever again.
mm,
So, and I suspected something like that would happen because some of my Christian friends, were quite Islamophobic as well. I crossed over to the enemy camp, so to speak, in their point of view. So I guess it's not unexpected, but also culturally, I realized that I had left one culture and, well, not left it. I had acquired the possibilities of exploring a wholly new culture, or cultures, I should say, and to see the world from that point of view as well. So to take the Middle East, Palestine, Israel, and so on, to begin to understand the experiences and the sufferings and the perspective of Muslims and non-Muslims, the Palestinian Christians, for example, as well, was something you don't normally do in the West. You kind of just take up what Fox News or the Daily Mail or whatever tell you. But so I was able to see the world from a different point of view. And I really liked that, actually. I found that really helpful to move from a recent philosopher who I've been talking about on my channel, Alexander Dugin, would have called moving from a unipolar perspective, from a multipolar to a multipolar perspective. In other words, seeing things from different points of view. I've always found that a fascinating thing to undertake, is to look for different perspectives, not necessarily embracing them, but understanding that people do see things differently. And often in the West, we don't understand that. We just think we're right. And
mm,
therefore the rest of the world, if they don't agree with us, they're just obstinate or bad people.
mm.
It's absurd, of course. So it's a very, very enlightening process for me.
Yeah, it's good that you touched upon that. Another question that someone did say was to ask you about the challenges that you face post acceptance of Islam, and you've just touched upon that. Can I ask how long ago that was in terms of when you embraced Islam, and also,
Oh, God, yeah.
um,
Unlike my Christianity thing, I didn't actually remember the date. I would say it was a good 15 years ago
oh,
now.
mashallah. Okay,
Mm.
and have you
Or maybe, yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, sorry.
have any of those friends subsequently made amends?
No.
Oh no.
I've made new
Mm,
friends and I've not looked back really. So no, that's No, sadly. I guess that happens in
Yeah,
time.
it does. Okay. The next question I had was, or the next set of questions, more to do with da'wah, or um, encouraging people or spreading the message of Islam, essentially. Um, and I think blogging theology is probably the best answer for that, which will come on in more detail further down the line. But in terms of, from your perspective, and I did watch a recent interview where you said that, look, you have to be more nuanced when someone asks you what's the best way to give da'wah, or a book that you recommend, because it depends on the other person, essentially, their level of intellect and various other factors. So let's say a working class English person, from your perspective and experience, what would you say is a recommended way of bringing them towards Islam?
That's a good question. I mean, I'm not even sure what an English working class person is. I mean, I know what you're saying, but I mean, again, gender, age, education level are relevant there too. They're not just all one bunch of people. They're obviously that would be very insulting and inaccurate. Um, I think what one of the ways that Muslims in general can give dawah is, and many Muslims do this extremely well, is simply to be good neighbors. Actually, and that might sound an odd thing to say, but if you demonstrate kindness and goodwill and care in very practical ways with your neighbors, your non-Muslim neighbors, then that really communicates a great deal about the nature of being a Muslim, because Muslims are practicing their faith when they do this. The Sunnah of the Prophet, the way he treated even his enemies. I forget the story in detail, but there's a woman who basically threw trash or dumped trash outside on the Prophet, and the way he responded and ultimately won her over was extraordinary. And that might not have involved any preaching or any discussion of Tawheed, for example. I mean, may have done, I don't know. But the point of that story is the way he won her over was through, non-retaliatory, not retaliating and attacking her, but seeing beyond her behavior to the wounded, hurt person beyond that, and in a way helping her to understand who he was by his responses to her. And I think there's a great wisdom there in how to relate to people. But I mean, of course, there are, using words as well, not just actions. Depending on who the neighbors are, if they're Christian neighbors or they're atheist neighbors, there are ways of talking to people which don't alienate them, encourage them on a journey. So it's quite a skill, and I think it requires a lot of goodwill and patience, and also remembering there's something that I forget, but it's good to be reminded, I guess, is that it's God who turns hearts. It's not us. We don't make people Muslims. It's like the Jordan Peterson thing. I mean, this guy has been given so much dawah now, probably more than anyone else on the planet. I mean, some of the best dawah carriers in the world, have approached him and spoken to him at length. I mean, I don't think he needs any more dawah, really. I mean, that's just my view, but I could be wrong. I mean, it's between him and God, really, now. But it's God who's going to turn his heart. He doesn't need more information. He doesn't need more arguments. If he ever did, he himself needs to make that journey towards the truth, and that's between him and God. There's nothing we can do, I think, anymore about that for him. I think, and he's not a working class guy; he's anything but. But it's the limitations of dawah as well. That it's not like we're promoting a secular ideology and trying to persuade people to become good, good socialists or good Marxists or something. Embrace these political philosophies and change it. It's not really like that. It's an invitation to embrace the truth that we already kind of know. Actually, deep down, the fitra is there, hopefully, and it echoes a part of our created nature. So it's not an alien creed. It's just reawakening our own instinctive, intuitive beliefs about God, about the world, about who we are, which are already within our nature. That's one way of putting it. And
yeah, so I think you're right in the sense, or that manners or how you act is a universal language, I guess, irrespective of someone's intellectual ability or social class, or everyone recognizes it. I think sometimes the difficulty is for the non-Muslim to see a connection between that good manners, good actions, and Islam, because it depends on the relationship. But I found, for example, when I was younger, I spent some time as a summer job working in a warehouse where I was able to interact with, like, let's say, the average working class, and the level of conversation and everything is a bit different to, say, when you're in an office environment. But I do feel as though you can have the most impact in long-term relationships. Say if you're working in an office for over a year, you've got a better opportunity being able to spread a good message of Islam or do da'wah in indirect, subtle ways, rather than let's say street da'wah, which there's a place for and there's a need for as well. But I just think most people, I would say it's a very small minority that are interested in, like, the very minute or intellectual points that, say, Sapiens Institute addresses, or other Dawah organizations. I think most people, they're impacted by the kind of what you spoke about in terms of, like, matters of the heart, how you make them feel, and things like that. And also this goes on to something that you're quite renowned for, actually, and this was also a very liked comment on YouTube, the no design excuse me, the no design emoji that you post. And I think that kind of symbolizes it, because it's appealing to people in a different kind of way. I wanted you to kind of expand on that idea.
Yeah, I mean, I'm surprised these are so popular, because I didn't start out with some grand plan that they would be popular, but they just have become so. And it's amazing. I still got one or two people who are convinced that I'm an atheist because I put no design with the emoji, the eyes up, thinking, oh, he's denying, no, actually, no. This is irony, meant to be, it's almost sarcasm, because the emoji is the clue. The eyes looking up means, what I'm saying is, the subtext is, how could you deny that there is a designer looking at this design? And this is what the Quran often calls people to, and that's the point of it, actually. Look at the ayat. It has a meaning of signs as well as, obviously, verses of the Quran. Just to reawakening this intuitive sense of God's creative power in the universe. And so the potential, for these posts is limitless. I could post pictures, and I have, of the cosmos, or a bird, or a plant, or anything. The DNA, they all, and there's a potential misunderstanding here as well. And this is a point I'm not going to push, because it's extremely controversial amongst Muslims as well as others. I'm not taking a pro or anti-evolution stance here. I am a creationist, but all believers are creationists in that we believe the universe is created by God. But that's different from saying I reject Darwin or reject the idea of Darwinian evolution. That's not what I'm doing, because I believe that everything, whether it be a simple rock or a tree or an apple or DNA or the cosmos, are all created by God, all show signs of intelligent design. But I'm not going to be posting pictures of rocks because, or just a tree. Well, I might do, actually, but because because this is social media, it doesn't work. But I'm not saying only DNA is created by God and other things are not, because like, rocks and boring things. I'm saying it's all created by God, but I don't post those kind of pictures because they just don't work on Twitter. They just not get the job. So, yeah, it's a very simple thing. It is to reawakening. I mean, there's almost a limitless supply of pictures of the marvels of God's creation, and it's extraordinary. So I churn them out. I enjoy doing them, and people get the point. Those who don't think I'm an atheist get the point, I should say. So, yeah, alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah. I think the vast majority of people get the point, but I think your growth on YouTube and social media, you're obviously faced with the negative comments as well, that I think kind of sometimes stay in the mind a bit. That negativity bias kind of kicks into effect. I wanted to ask, when you became Muslim, was there any period of confusion around the different sects, and how did you navigate that, if at all?
Yes, there was. Absolutely right. Because I developed quite a sophisticated intellectual map of Christianity, Christian theology, the history of Christianity, the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation and patristics and Catholic theology and Protestant. I mean, you name it. I really drunk deeply from that well for a long time. And I studied at the university. But then when I encountered Islam, I suddenly realized there was a parallel universe going on here and that I didn't know anything. And I was really aware, and I was very explicitly aware in my mind. I had no map. I didn't know where to start. I kind of vaguely knew I was a Sunni, but I wasn't really sure why. And I knew nothing of the great thinkers of history, whether it be, Al-Ghazali, Ibn Taymiyyah, or whoever, or the eponymous founders of the four madhabs. I didn't know about that. I didn't know anything. And that was a real acute sense of, I needed to understand this. I wanted to understand this. And so that's been my journey that over the recent years, is to become acquainted with this. And then equally interesting is to look at the interconnectedness between the Islamic tradition and the Western tradition, because they are actually interconnected much, much more than I ever realized, in terms of influences, directly and indirectly, historically and intellectually and theologically. And the way that a lot of Islamic ideas have actually came before Western ideas and fed into Western thought later at the Renaissance, for example, or even before that. Thomas Aquinas, for example, who drew heavily on Muslim philosophers. And so to see that interconnectedness was really, really interesting, because I already knew to some extent about the Western tradition. So I was waiting to see these connections become real. And when I saw them, that was particularly fascinating. But it's a many lifetimes journey, this, isn't it? Go on forever. I'm always exploring. I discovered, a particular thinker who, in many ways, is deeply troubling and unfashionable to many people, who I've come to have a huge respect for his mind. And that is a much misunderstood figure called Ibn Taymiyyah, who I'm sure your viewers have heard of him. But I say it's been misunderstood, but he's the most, I didn't start off being a fanboy of Ibn Taymiyyah. I didn't start off as being a Salafi. I was a Muslim. I came into Islam through the Sufi door. That's just the way I came into Islam, through Sufism. The works of Guy Eaton, for example, the English Sufi writer. So to discover Ibn Taymiyyah, particularly his intellectual engagement with other schools of thought, his criticisms of Asharite theology, and his methodology, and his criticisms of Kalam, of course. This was really, really interesting. And he had a phenomenal mind. He's one of the great intellects in the history of the world, I think. But he's much misunderstood, particularly in the West. I won't go into the reasons why, because that would take us off into another world. But so yes, Al-Ghazali, great. He was much more mainstream, but less mainstream figures also interested me. And I came to have a real appreciation for their contributions to the Ummah, in terms of reviving the Ummah and calling people back to perhaps a more authentic understanding of faith. This is all very controversial, but these things are unavoidable if one looks at these issues.
Yeah, because I always, growing up as well, you experience this kind of debate and difference between the various different branches of Sunni Islam. And I think the internet has kind of changed that to an extent, because now younger Muslims especially, you're able to develop an understanding as to where this person or this group is coming from, in terms of like the pathways of their mind that led them to that position. Whereas growing up, I'd say before YouTube became more commonplace, you were only exposed to, say, if you went to your local masjid who subscribed to a particular sect of Sunni Islam, let's say. And the one striking example for me was growing up just a few years before YouTube became mainstream. There was Peace TV by Dr. Zakir Naik. And for me, that was like, because I was in a non-Muslim school, and I started listening to Dr. Zakir Naik when I was perhaps 14 or 15. And
Mm.
obviously on a relatively simple level, for that age, it allowed me to carry my faith with confidence. I remember in religious
Mm.
education classes when the teacher would say something about Islam and then double check with me, or just because I was the only Muslim there, she'd like say, isn't that
Mm.
right, or something. And I remember having this like confidence from how he was able to articulate certain things about science and Islam and all the rest of it. But then
Mm.
I would go to the local masjid, and the khutbah, which is the last 10 minutes, let's say, before the Jummah Salah starts, which is like the prime opportunity where you can impact the most amount of Muslims, would be about why
Mm.
you need to tell your kids not to listen to Dr. Zakir Naik because, you know, the Aqidah is different
Right.
and stuff like that. But there was no
Yeah.
alternative being presented. It's not like they were saying, come to the masjid on Thursday and we've got a young brother who speaks English and he can deal with it. It was just like, and I think obviously once you get to university and you meet different Muslims from different parts of the world, you get that understanding beyond um, the level of like, another example is when we used to go for Taraweeh Salah, and say different Muslims who pray 8 and get up. The elder Muslims that we used to see, they used to turn around and like shake their head at it and stuff, as if it was so clearly wrong, right? And it's like a minor ficky thing. So
Yeah.
yeah, so that was interesting. But I wanted to ask you about, I think your blog predates blogging theology on YouTube, doesn't it?
Yeah. Still going. Yeah. That's been going for years, and I still feed it occasionally with content, but it has very few people who visit it and read the stuff, and I don't plug it because it's been superseded by other platforms I use. But yeah, it's been going for a long time. Yeah.
And where did the idea of a podcast come from? Because just purely in podcasting terms or audience building terms, let's say, which isn't necessarily an aim a Muslim should necessarily have just for the sake of it, but it's remarkable in terms of the growth. And I saw that you only started it, I think, March 2020, the YouTube channel. And the main reason I would say is consistent, high quality, engaging content, which you're able to put out, mashallah. But just tell us about the journey behind starting the podcast and where the idea came from.
Yeah, again, it's a very uninspiring story. A couple of years ago during lockdown, COVID lockdown, obviously, I found myself, as we all did actually, trapped in our homes. I mean, I had a job which meant I was a key worker, so I was able to go out to work. A lot of people didn't go out, and shops were closed, and it was a very isolating experience for many, as it was for me. So at that time, I just happened to come into a bit of money, and I bought a new MacBook Pro, the one I'm still using now, to replace my old clunky one, which barely functions. And it was a MacBook Pro that I really didn't need. I mean, it was like it did things with huge memory that was way beyond my requirements and needs at that time. But hey, I thought I want to buy one. Hey, so I bought the best one I could on the market, and I thought, well, what do I do now? So I'll make a YouTube video, but I'll just do it about what I want to talk about, which is, I forget what it was now, but it was something to do with the Bible probably. And just as a way of communicating with the world through social media. I had no intention of starting blogging theology as it is now, no intention of inviting guests or anything like that. This was not, I had no grand vision, no plan at all, beyond reaching out during COVID isolation. That was the original context. And then, so I think I started posting videos in November, the year before last. Before that, it was just nothing happened on the channel. It was just a name. Um, and within weeks, it began to take off. And let me just on. Let me just come out of that, because that was my WhatsApp, and I do normally switch this off. And my apologies. I'm just
No
going to
problem.
log out. There we go. So over a period of weeks, I started to get more and more viewers, subscribers. And I remember January, year before last, I think, I had at 1,000 subscribers, and wow, this was amazing. And And then I thought, well, why don't I invite someone on? Because I'd read some books, obviously, and some of them behind me. And I really like to meet these authors. And so I remember I actually reached out to another Englishman who lives in Atlanta, who is a biblical scholar, Unitarian Christian, actually. And he's called Sir Anthony Buzzard. It's a wonderful name, called Buzzard, and he's an Englishman living in the States, professor, I think retired now at some Bible college there. His father actually was like head of naval intelligence during the Second World War. He comes from a very distinguished aristocratic background. Anyway, I invited, I was kind of vaguely aware who he was. I thought, let's just see if I could have a conversation with him about Unitarian Christianity, who Jesus was. So he very graciously and perhaps unexpectedly said yes. And so we had and he's actually a really, really nice guy. And we had a great time for about an hour and a half on what was then Blogging Theology, one of the first ever guests I had. He was the first ever. And that really broke the barrier for me, because I thought, wow, I've invited someone, it really worked well, and I had a really good time, and the guests had a really good time, I think, and people liked it. I thought, I'll invite someone else. And then I invited a much more senior academic, because Buzzard, bless him, he's not like a professor in a mainline university. So I invited someone who was a serious, very prestigious biblical scholar. And amazingly, this is Dominic Crossan, who's one of the great biblical scholars of the late 20th century. He actually agreed as well. And that was a great interview. So this really started something new, which I hadn't planned for. And that is to invite guests on, but with the objective not of arguing with them, debating with them like I do at Speaker's Corner, but with actually listening to them and learning from them. So that I'm there to receive knowledge and expertise from them, and invite other viewers to participate in a sense like I am in what's been offered to us through expertise. So I've always seen the channel is not about me, of course. It's about the content. It's about the guests, or about the books, the book reviews, or whatever. It's not about me, but because it's been led by what I enjoy and what I find interesting. So I haven't followed any rules. There are lots of videos out there will tell you how to build a successful YouTube channel, whatever. And I've seen some of them, and I've noticed that I don't follow any of their advice, unfortunately. And I've been I've broken the rules. I mean, for example, you're not supposed to have videos longer than, I don't know, 10, 20 minutes, because everyone's attention span is so limited. I mean, I did a video in June with Professor Al-Tubki, one of America's leading professors at an Ivy League university, for 4 hours. And you just don't do that. And yet it was a success. It went viral. It's one of the most successful, things I've ever done. So over 111,000 views just in a couple of months for 4 hours. And, it's talking about LGBT and Islam.
Yeah.
Obviously extremely important subject. It's a brilliant video. Professor Tubki is an amazing academic of the highest caliber, and he's able really to explain the origins of this situation we're in, what it means for Muslims, and what the Islamic position actually is in terms of the Quran and the Sunnah. He does it brilliantly. And so that's kind of what I do. I share with others what I would very much like to hear from these scholars. And that apparently has met a need for a lot of people. That's the point. And I didn't realize there was this need. I didn't realize it was niche. I didn't realize it would be as it is. So alhamdulillah, it has been a success, but that's by primarily the grace of God, but also because it's a niche thing and is meeting that need that people have, I think.
Yeah, it's funny that you say you didn't follow any of like the standard tips and tricks about, but I think it goes back down to high quality content consistently, and it's meeting a need as well. I think Muslims, they're very much, you can tell by the comments, and also how I feel just from my perspective when I see some of this content. I think I did watch part of the video that you're referring to. And another thing I've noted that you do somewhat differently that I've not even seen on like the non-Muslim podcast is essentially you will have a guest on, and obviously you're discussing ideas and whatnot. Whereas, say on this podcast, I like to learn more about the guests. Like I previously had Daniel Hay had you just about daily routine and his personality and things like that that otherwise might not get covered. But then you also invite guests to give presentations, which I think is very key because they're able to articulate in a way that they can best present their ideas. And it's something I'm thinking of doing with like Islamic psychology because I'm interested in that, and I took inspiration from that. So that's another unique thing that I think you do really well.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder if I have been hopefully providing a kind of like a safe space for academics to come on and discuss, come out of the ivory tower perhaps and discuss their work, their books, and so on, with a wider audience. Because the guests are usually people who have something to say that is of a great interest to the wider world. For example, my last video I did was with an academic from who did his PhD at the University of Toronto, Dr. Michael Millerman, talking about the political philosophy of Russian philosopher Alexander Dugin. And I got some serious criticism from a very distinguished Muslim academic. He publicly criticized what I did. And I haven't publicly responded, and I have no plans to, except now I'm going to say that the reason I felt, because he thought this is really, really bad timing to do this video because of what's going on in Ukraine, of course, because Dugin is a supporter of the war, Putin's action in Ukraine. And he thought it was appalling, basically, that I should have someone who supports Putin on my channel, at such a difficult time. And my answer to that, really, I haven't given a public answer but I will now, but is that it's always good to understand what other people are thinking, especially when you don't agree with them. And that, there may be this terrible conflict going on. I don't have an opinion, by the way. I'm not here to endorse or oppose anyone. That's kind of not my pay grade. I mean, who am I to have? Yeah, it's not the point. But to understand the political and philosophical ideas that may or may not have informed Putin's mind, his own worldview, I think is really important, actually, because we need to understand the guy, and we need to understand Russian foreign policy, its aims and objectives. How do the Russian elites see the West? And to actually not want to understand that, I think, is for me incomprehensible. Why would we not want to understand it? Doesn't mean in understanding something or having a guest on like Dr. Millerman, who is clearly sympathetic with Dugin. It doesn't mean I'm saying to the world, agree with Dugin. I'm not saying I agree with Dugin on everything. I think on some things he has some very interesting insights, to be honest. But it's so we can listen and understand what other people think, and people who we really don't approve of, perhaps, like Putin, President Putin of Russia. And that's okay. We're adults. We can hopefully handle this and not see it as a threat or something that should be shut down because there's a conflict going on. And so that's my response. So I think, having someone talking about Dugin, rather, from a sympathetic point of view, does not mean that we're become Putin apologists. It means we're trying to understand responsibly how they think, or how they probably think, about world events, which is the context in which the current war in Ukraine is happening. And I don't see why that's a bad thing. And if I do it impartially or objectively, which I hope I did, then what's to object to? And it's not a platform that's advocating Dugin or Putin. That's not what happened. That's not what happened at all in the video. And no one's alleging I've done that, I think, apart from this one guy, perhaps. So that was quite some very strong criticism from a senior British Muslim academic. But I checked out with other people who kind of advised me, to make sure I don't do anything too stupid, that they thought what I did was fine, that there was nothing there to be ashamed of or to regret in any way criticize. So I stand my ground. The video is fine. I think Dr. Millerman did an extremely good presentation of Dugin's philosophy. It's a very, very popular video. It's gone a little bit viral. It's had a huge number of hits. And I've only heard positive things from people, apart from this one academic who basically did a fairly ad hominem thing about me, saying, you shouldn't have done that. Very bad. But there you
Mm.
go. But there's another lesson I have learned, by the way. The hard way, is that I'm not going to please everyone all the time. There was an early stage when I got a lot of criticism over. I'm not going to go into the subject, but it was the most serious threat that I had faced in terms of the content production on BT. And I really had to think hard about what the channel is about, why I do it. And I came through that, and I made a statement saying, this is what the channel is about. So there's some people who are not going to like what I do. That's fine by me. They don't have to watch it anyway. Uh, so, for me now, it doesn't faze me hardly at all now. In fact, this criticism I got recently didn't faze me. It was just, why is he saying that? Why is he objecting to me having a discussion on political philosophy? So it was kind of curiosity and slight disbelief why anyone would object to it, rather than, oh my God, criticized by this individual, and who I do respect, by the way, and does a lot of good things for the British Muslim community. He's produced an excellent report recently. And he's been a guest on the channel. This is the other thing. And inshallah, he will be a guest again. But it doesn't faze me like it would. Criticism like that no longer phases me.
Yes, I was actually going to ask you about dealing with criticism, and especially with the rapid growth that blogging theology has had. So you've touched on it nicely. I also think it's good from the perspective that you noted this criticism because it was from an academic, someone that you respect. So you're not even in the territory that a lot of YouTubers fall into, of just giving random criticism attention, of like a random commenter, let's say. Because people, like you said, will object to all sorts of things. I've not really, my project is obviously very small at the minute. But even you get the odd random comment that just sticks in your mind compared to all of the good stuff. Even though, like, say, Optimize Muslim, it's about the idea of trying to improve Muslims. And I've had one person quote it in quotation marks, saying that I'm trying to say I'm Optimized Muslim. And he's like, Optimized Muslim, do you think? And I was like, but you can't really focus on that. And I don't either, because it's just like, out of 100 people, you can say at least 1% is going to be clinically insane anyway. So it's like, so
I thought you think it's such a low percentage. 1%. Oh, hi.
Yeah, it's higher than that. So I feel like you have to filter it from that lens. But I think you're a very much, mashallah, much loved figure within the Muslim community, and it's great to see how you've managed to navigate it, because it's easy to get into silos. Say if I was a graduate, I'm not, from some kind of Darul Uloom or Jamia Al-Karam or something. It's very easy because of the community that would be around me, my class fellows and ustads and teachers. It'd be harder for me to interview people who aren't within that specific line, because you have to kind of deal with that alienation aspect, which I think you've managed to do really well.
Really, it was a really good point, because I do have very strong views on lots of things. But I often invite guests on who certainly don't share my views, and I'm aware of that. And because the channel's not about me, as I keep on saying, it's about their expertise. So I had one guy on, I won't mention who it is because I don't want to reopen this issue, who's incredibly controversial, and but he has a specific area of expertise. He's got a PhD from Harvard on this subject, and he's very good at talking about it. And I invited him on to talk about it, and he did it brilliantly for a couple of hours, like 3 hours or something. But the rest of his theology, without giving too much away, is something I don't agree with at all. And he knows this, and he's a serious academic. And I got a lot of stick from a lot of people about that. That was the thing that really produced the crisis about a year ago. But on reflection, I decided that I did the right thing, because he is a responsible academic in the field that he is an expert on, and that's what he spoke about, and he provided good content that could benefit everyone. And that was why I invited him on. But in terms of his own kind of theology or whatever, absolutely, without going any further, we don't share the same worldview. So the question is it a Muslim channel that should promote Orthodox, traditional, Sunni Islamic views? No. And there was a time when I was inching towards that being the case. And I realized that if I did that, then suddenly everything would narrow down. Most people wouldn't come on, and it would be just it would be a betrayal of the DNA that the channel was supposed to be about. So it's a difficult one.
Mm.
And I had a friend of mine who is an academic at Oxford University. I won't say his name, bless him. Who made two criticisms. He said this is actually this morning, so this isn't new, really. But he said to me, he likes what I do, and he's a good friend, and he's a very distinguished academic at Oxford. And he said, "Look, I want to share some criticisms of your channel, Paul." Oh my goodness me, what's he going to say? And he said two things which I thought were really good. This is feedback he's had from friends and colleagues at Oxford. One is the extremely small number of women scholars I've had on, and this is true. I've only had about 2 female academics or speakers at all on the channel. This is a valid criticism. By the way, I'm not into having proportionally representative gender equality. Absolutely not my thing at all. But there have been far too fewer, female scholars. I have tried, and it's not always easy to successfully bring them on, but this is a valid criticism. Secondly, and my friend at Oxford is not a Shia, but he said, it's been said to him, why have you not had any Shia scholars on to talk about the Shia understanding of this, that, and the other? That's a good point. I did invite one on, and he just never replied. But nevertheless, there is a need for me, I think, to have an expert, at least one expert, on talking about the Shia understanding of the immanate, for example, the whole thing. So those two criticisms, I think, are valid. And I will, as a result of that, I took immediate steps to try and rectify that by contacting various people I know. So that's some criticism. I mean, the audio visual quality of my early videos was appalling. That's because, if you look at the older videos, I mean, they're just awful in terms of the production values. But my excuse is that's because I simply had no idea what I was doing. I didn't actually know how to produce good videos. And it's taken me, the learning curve has been quite steep in learning actually how to use good cameras and have good audio, et cetera, et cetera. And I didn't know about this. I simply was, so that's been a big change as well.
Yeah. No, I've noted, especially on your most recent ones, the segments that you do when you're quoting from a book yourself, the camera quality on those, I don't know what it is, but it's absolutely amazing.
Oh, I can tell you, it's easy. It's this. It's my iPhone. It's the latest iPhone. So this has got a. Let me just get it out. So what's it called? Cinematic. There we go.
Yeah.
The cinematic screen on this is outstanding, and I just use that to film my thoughts on. So yeah, it's not even my MacBook Pro. It's the app on my iPhone.
Yes, and even in that recent podcast that you mentioned, Alexander Dugin, I watched that actually. I listened to it, and I think towards the end, you provided a good kind of summary of not where you stand, but the idea behind why you invited this guest. So, obviously, there are going to be some people that have criticisms and whatnot, but I think you've addressed that point well and good. The other thing I wanted your take on is, because I know of certain podcasts, I can think of one relatively big Muslim podcast. It's not necessarily on like the intellectual side like yours. It's more so about guests, and similar to this one, they will invite non-Muslims on, like notable non-Muslims who have had some kind of interaction with Muslim community, but they won't invite Muslims that they feel aren't within their kind of way of thinking. And I just found that strange. I can see the justification from their way of thinking, because they'll say this person is more likely to.
Yeah, exactly. I had that issue. People are saying, it doesn't matter what non-Muslim you are, but don't invite deviants on, who believe X or believe Y. And I'm thinking, okay, yeah, maybe you're right. And I'm thinking, actually, no, if I go down that path, it will destroy the channel, because I'm not inviting people on who I disagree with to give them a platform to preach at us. I'm inviting people on who have a specific expertise in a specific area to share that with us, share knowledge with us. Now, my attitude is very much take what is good from what they say and ignore the rest.
Mm.
So if I invite an Ismaili academic on, which I have, I'm not giving a platform to Ismaili apologists so that they can do whatever to Sunni Muslims. It's not my agenda is to, they have specific expertise, which is not really to do with their confessional position. In this particular case, to do with the Injil in the Quran and the New Testament, which is really, really beneficial. And that's why they were invited on. But I was criticized for giving a platform to someone like that. But I think on reflection, having taken soundings from responsible friends and colleagues, what I did was perfectly legitimate. But there's not a perfect world. You know what I mean? It is, you know, I'm not saying I've got it all correct and all right, but I've reached the decisions I have based on serious consideration and reflection. If people don't agree with it, that's absolutely fine, and they don't have to watch the channel.
Mm.
But it's what I do.
Yeah.
And if by the grace of God it works, alhamdulillah, then I'm happy with it.
Alhamdulillah. So turning to more selfish questions, I'd say, towards the latter end of the podcast, I wanted to ask who manages the podcast, as in behind the scenes, because inviting guests and dealing with timing and scheduling is actually sometimes quite difficult. I was wondering if you do that, or do you have an assistant, or who manages the whole kind of project?
That's a good question. Well, I have someone in India who is kind of a producer. I won't mention his name because I haven't asked his permission, but he creates the thumbnails, and he downloads the videos from StreamYard or Zoom, and tops and tails them, you know, as the Blogging Theology logo at the beginning. He adds any photographs or any whatever during it, and edits them if they need editing. So he does all that, which is really great. There is someone else also who has assisted in contacting people and putting the subtitles into Arabic and 24 other languages. Actually, that's an ongoing work as well. But I'd say most of the legwork is just mine. Actually, really. I can't say. Yeah, in terms of inviting guests, like 90% of the time, the last 2 years or year and a half, it's been me. I just fire off the bells and say, "Hi, you know, how are you? Do you want to come on?" So yeah,
that's really impressive, mashallah, especially with the level of doing maybe 2 or 3 a week. It's very impressive.
It's too many, and I'm really pushing back on. I know it sounds, again, this is not what you're supposed to do. It breaks all the rules, but I'm actually trying to produce less content. I've got this this kind of rule thing. 1 + 1 + 1. This is not the argument about the Trinity, by the way. This is anything else. So videos per week. So what one hopefully major interview a week, the biggie. So that'd be like the Dr. Millerman thing on Dugin. Secondly, a much shorter one, 10, 20 minutes, where I do my own thing in terms of book reviews or whatever. And thirdly, a short, you know, these under 60-second videos. So 1 + 1 + 1 in a week. So rather than doing 2 or 3 major interviews, there's several reasons. One, because it's actually a hell of a lot of work for me, because a lot of these guests for the big interviews, you know, I mean, Dr. Al-Tubki came on to talk about something about Ibn Taymiyyah's work. He actually said I had to read his book on this, which is actually a PhD doctoral dissertation. And I did read it. I remember sitting in Bahrain in a hotel when I was on holiday reading this thing. Now, it's fantastic reading it, but to actually read a PhD thesis, just to have an interview with someone, is hard work, obviously. And this is often the case. I had Dr. Abdullah Ali in talking about, you know, is Islamic law against women? And he'd written a book. So I had to read that book before the interview. And it's great. I mean, it's a huge privilege to actually meet the authors of these books, but it's actually quite intensive. I don't always read books, by the way, when I have these guests, but often I do, or at least articles, you know, academic articles, which is cool. But the other problem is that if I produce too much content, it's indigestible for the viewers. You know, I mean, you just can't assimilate it all. It's just too much. So I'm just trying to pull back a bit, produce less content, and to give everyone a breather, give myself an easier life, perhaps.
Mm.
But yeah, I haven't got the balance right yet. That's for
Mm.
sure.
Yeah, it's I forgot to mention that. So adding to that impressive nature is the fact that your interviews are a lot more about ideas. Whereas, say, if I just want to have a guest on and I'm intrigued by their personality, you can just ask
Mm.
general questions. I guess you have to be somewhat familiar with their work. In the next couple of weeks, I've got one where the guest has written a book on masculinity for Muslims. So that's one where I'm going to have to do kind of the research and stuff behind it. So that's an interesting point that you mentioned. I wanted to ask, perhaps you want to mention who, or perhaps not, some guests that you've not yet interviewed, but you'd really like to.
Oh, yes. I think Professor Walel Halak, who many people might not have heard, he's a professor at Columbia University. He's written books like Introduction to Islamic Law. He's written a book on, what has he written? That's it, Restating Orientalism, A Critique of Modern Knowledge. I'm just looking at one of the books. He is a phenomenal intellect, and he's extremely relevant. He's one guy. In fact, I haven't invited him yet because I feel I ought to read at least 3 of his books before I do, and I've only read one of them. But his books are really high level, fascinating. He's a guy who is American citizen, but he was born in Nazareth. I think some other guy was born there. I forget. Anyway, he's a Palestinian Christian from Nazareth in Palestine, who has said some incredible things about Sharia, Islamic law, and so on. Not least that he'd much rather live under a Sharia-based system than he would in America, because for a whole bunch of really interesting reasons. There's a YouTube video about that. But he's also incredibly distinguished academic. He's produced some amazing criticisms of Orientalist epistemology, and his understandings of the state, Islamic State. He's written a book called The Impossible State as well, which is excellent. So I really love to have him on, but I don't feel that I'm ready yet for him because he is such a, I really need to do more homework before I could possibly have him on. Jordan Peterson, I'm going off. I thought I'd like to, but I'm going off the idea, to be honest. But I think if I did, it wouldn't be to talk to him about. It wouldn't be to do Dawah to him because he's been Dawah to death. It would be to hear him talk about his expertise, which is clinical psychology. So to talk about gender, to talk about all those issues that he's so brilliant at talking about, feminism, wokeism, and all that. I'd love to discuss that with him. But I think the Dawah thing, he's been given more Dawah than most people on earth, I think. And perhaps I would like to focus on what he's actually an expert on, which is psychology.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, someone asked for me to ask you about Dr. Jordan Peterson. I think you'd have to make sure you've got your terms defined beforehand. So what do you mean by do you accept God?
Yes. So this is, I absolutely not going to go down that path. Again, my channel is not about doing Dawah to people anyway, at least not directly. Hint. No, but I mean, it's about, hearing their expertise. So he's an expert in certain fields and he really is worth hearing in certain areas. And I would love to have him as a guest for that purpose, but not to get his views on Islam. And he's not an expert on these things, actually. I get a Christian theologian on or a biblical scholar, and I do. I'm incredibly fortunate to have them on. I talk to them rather than him about Christianity or Islam.
I think the previous academic that you mentioned that you'd like to interview, am I correct in thinking he was discussed in your interviews with Imam Tom Fakeen? When you were reviewing his books, I think Imam Tom went through his books, or
Professor Talal Assad.
Right.
But this is the book that we for Formations of the Secular. Probably one of the dullest titles of a book I've ever come across, but it's actually a brilliant, brilliant book. And there are lots of people like that I'd love to have on. Absolutely. The people I'd like to have on again, actually, this is probably more people like Professor Ali Attai. He's hugely popular, and he's such a stunning intellect and communicator. I'm in touch with him on WhatsApp, but he is coming on in a couple of months, God willing. People like him, Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, inshallah, is coming in the end of next month. And other people as well have said they will come on in due course.
Yeah.
So
I think Yeah, I've also, I think I'll also try and reach out to Dr. Ali, inshallah, because I've been quite inspired by some of the things that he said. I really liked your interview with Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad. And
Yes.
what about, just throwing it out there, blogging theology and King Charles?
Yeah, in your dreams, in our dreams.
I,
It ain't gonna happen.
I
It
thought
ain't
that
gonna
was a
happen, boy.
brilliant little episode that you did on King Charles's
Mm.
view towards Islam and whatnot. So
I agonized. The friends and I agonized over that for days because the Queen had just died, and it was obvious that Charles was going to be the next king. As soon as she passed away, he became king. So I thought, wow, I'll do a video on Charles and Islam. And friends of mine say, you can't do it. We're at the nation's mourning. You can't do a video. It'd be really bad timing. And so I wanted to do this video, but when can I do this video? So I don't upset people, or I don't want to kind of break diplomatic protocol by putting. And then, of course, Charles himself did a walkabout outside Buckingham Palace. This was like 48 hours within his mother's death. And I thought, well, that's it. If he can go around meeting the public and shaking their hands, which he did, I can do a video. I mean, he's not in seclusion. He's not like, oh, I've got to respect his grief and not say anything for 6 days or a week, or whatever it was. He's out and about. So that was the green light. I thought, fine, we were good to go. So I just did this video for 12 minutes, and it's had over 500,000 hits since then. And it's the most popular video I've ever done in terms of viewers, of course. And it was great. It was perfect. It turns out, in retrospect, it was perfectly timed.
yeah.
It really was.
Mm.
That was just good fortune,
Mm.
really. But no, he's not just King John. He's the head of state, and they don't appear on YouTube videos. It just doesn't happen diplomatically. It's politically impossible.
Okay. Bringing everything, you've been very gracious with your time. So just wondering, how do you need to go exactly in 5 minutes, or do we have something more to play with?
No, it's okay. No rush.
Okay.
Have a cup of tea. So I'm fine. Yeah, it's good.
Okay. So on the topic of reading, because I know even in your YouTube this bio description, you describe yourself as a bibliophile. How
Incurable. Incurable.
Yeah.
A self-confessed incurable bibliophile is the technical definition of my condition. Yeah. In other words, I can't stop reading.
So
Just keep on reading and reading.
I heard something recently that kind of, because in the kind of self-development space, there's a lot of this stuff about optimization of reading, and listen to something on 2x speed and 3x speed, and you can speed read and all the rest of it. But there was an author who said that.
So I really don't like any of this, but anyway, yeah, carry on.
So there was an author who said that even if you're the most prolific of readers, there's only, let's say, a few thousand books that you're going to read in your lifetime. The amount of books probably won't feel like a small library. So you have to be somewhat selective in how you choose which books to read. And I was considering, how do you, at this stage, are you still guided by your interests or recommendations? How do you choose which books to read? And do you read them? Do you read them in a way where, I know some people have this thing where if they open a book, they have to finish it page by page, and other people have this method of just skimming whatever gem sticks, and like not using the book in that way, rather than being like, I have to read each page by page and finish the book. So what's your approach?
I'm probably not a good person to ask, because I don't really have any. I know Sheikh Hamza Yusuf has this course or whatever. How to read.
I saw that. Yeah,
very structured, reflected, educated way. This is how and I don't have any of that, unfortunately. So I'm probably not a good person to ask. I might lead people astray because I don't have that. I'm driven by my own nafs. Really, it's like, what I want to read. This is what it is. It just happens to be that my reading is quite eclectic. I mean, I've got some examples here. I put them here before we started about what I'm currently reading, and just explain to you the different kinds of reading that I do. Because I'm reading this book at the moment. It's a French book. Originally, it's called it's by Marcel Proust, and one of the English translation is Remembrance of Things Past or Time Lost, depending on how you translate it. And this is a great novel written in the early 20th century, probably the greatest novel of the 20th century. This is the first installment, Swan's Way, and you see it's quite thick. But the point of me reading this is that a lot of people say, and they're absolutely right, if you read this book in translation or in the original French, is that you read it slowly, because the Marcel Proust has a whole worldview where you just really need to immerse yourself in it and take your time and just go through it. And it's very, well, some of it is quite stream of consciousness stuff. But once you kind of get involved in his mind and his ways of thinking, it's the most extraordinary book. It's probably the greatest novel of the 20th century. You don't put this on 2x. You don't speed through it, because you will destroy the delicate French aroma. It's meant to be savored and not, bulldozed through. So that's one example. Another book I'm reading, completely different subject. Sultan Abdul Hamid II, the last great Ottoman Sultan. This is a translation, and this is the history of, obviously, this guy, because I'm quite interested in the Ottoman Empire. Another book I'm reading by one of my former guests, Dale Allison, is professor of Princeton University, one of the most distinguished universities in the States. He's an extremely brilliant man. And this has just been published, Encountering Mystery, Religious Experience in a Secular Age. And he's talking about all sorts of things like near-death experiences, or people who think they've seen ghosts, or people who've had amazing experiences of God, or experiences of evil. He talks about those who've experienced an evil presence in their room, or and so on and so on. And it's the most extraordinary book, because it's talking about religious experience in the West at a time when official religion is, in many countries, virtually extinct. And yet, beneath the surface, many people, millions of people, according to reports and studies, have very vivid and life-changing religious experiences, which are not connected to organized religion. And this book, which had literally been published a few weeks ago, is a very readable and daring book in a way, because he's exploring this kind of underworld of experiences. It's very, he doesn't really talk about Muslim experiences or Christian experiences, but I think it's fascinating. Anyway, so I'm reading that one. That's great fun. But I'm reading other books. I tend to read about 5 or 6 books at the same time, and depending on the kind of book it is. So this one reads slowly. This one I can read fairly fast, and this one, because of the author, and he's just so amazing, I just enjoy reading. He's so good with words and expressions, and the way he has insights into psychology, human experience, are very intelligent and non-judgmental. And so I kind of savor that book. It's not something I feel I have to plow through to get to the end. But my academic works, I will be much more systematic and read them through, even if I don't like them or find them interesting or juicy. I will, because I have an objective, which is to understand the whole contents, I will push myself. It's like when you're jogging or you're running, I'm too tired, and you just you keep on running, you keep on pushing it, because you've got a goal. And that's how I do it with some of the more academic books, which are quite demanding, actually, because I'm not, if I do it just on the basis of well, am I enjoying this book? I'm not going to finish, because I'm going to get bored after an hour or whatever. So I have different strategies depending on the genre of book I'm reading.
Yeah, no, that's a great, that's exactly what I was wanting to hear in terms of like your insights and how your process essentially. What about the issue of recall in terms of like remembering some of the stuff that you read? As in, does that pain you sometimes to think that the things that you read, there's certain things that will just intuitively stick out to you and perhaps like register in your brain for whatever reason, depending on various different factors, I guess. But other than that, do you have a system for remembering or note taking and things like that?
Yeah. Oh, note taking. Yeah, I do use Barrows and I've got yellow markers or whatever. Absolutely, that's quite important. I think remembering, I actually find a great way to remember things I've discovered, and this is a commonplace, this has often been observed in people, is if you explain, if I'm reading a book, say, on the historical understanding of the Gospels in the New Testament, a great way to remember it is to explain what I've just read to someone else. So just talk to them about this book, what is redaction criticism, what is Christology, what is textual, and actually explain these concepts to another person verbally, sometimes in discussion, sometimes even in debate. And then that really helps to clarify and embed what I've read. In a way, the alternative is just within my own mind, kind of almost like a solipsistic experience, just within my own experience. And then it tends to stick far less. So actually talking about it to someone else helps to really make it a part of the intellectual furniture. And so I've done that with some books so many times now that I kind of walk around with this apparatus, and I know that I just, it's quite dangerous in a way, because particularly at Speaker's Corner and debate, I know I can just deploy this, and it can be, if it's weaponized, which is not good. If it was weaponized, it could be quite dangerous. It can be quite, you can really cut down argument, but it can be quite lethal. By lethal, I mean, the arguments are so powerful and they're so intellectually acute but you don't, if you're debating someone, you don't want to devastate them. You want to bring them on board. So you've got to be careful how you deploy this information, because it can be very subversive of their world. If they have certain ideas, if they're fundamentalists, for example. So one has to be careful to deploy this knowledge in a sensitive way, rather than just using it as a weapon to beat them, because it's powerful stuff. So, there's with knowledge comes responsibility. One can't just deploy it. One has to be careful how one does it. And I made lots of mistakes in this area when I've used knowledge perhaps inappropriately, thinking at Speaker's Corner, of course. And that's not.
Yeah, because it's now, especially with more and more technology, and everything's becoming a bit more quite weird. Actually, I was looking at something recently where someone was saying that you're able to download this person's brain. It sounds all crazy, but what he actually meant was he had got someone to transcribe every single post and every single clip of what this person had said. It was to do with internet marketing and whatnot and business, and he'd put it in a database that was searchable and linkable as well. So essentially, if you wanted to learn something particular about the psychology of sales or something, it'd come up with all the instances this person said it. And if you think about how you could potentially use that same idea with certain Islamic figures, it's quite interesting to think where that could go potentially in terms of like using that level of technology to kind of gather someone's ideas in one place. And the final final set of questions, 5 or so more minutes, if that's okay.
That's cool.
I wanted to ask you, so what's a day in the life of Brother Paul Williams?
Well, it depends on what day of the week it is. Was it Saturday today? I slept in and had a nice breakfast, and then I'm chatting to you. So that's my day so far. Nothing terribly eventful to talk about. But other days of the week, I try and, I have a certain routine, and emailing, checking comments, because I have to check them for a whole bunch of reasons. Emailing people, research, study, conversation. There's a whole bunch of stuff that I have to do. And it's amazing how the time flies by, but even this morning, I've already invited a couple of academics to come on just on WhatsApp. It's just so it's quite unstructured in that way, but I do end up kind of having an overall plan. But it's nothing very interesting, believe me.
Okay.
It's very routine.
Can I ask what was because another person asked this and I wasn't sure whether to ask you or not, but can I ask what your profession was, or like what your working life consisted of, or if it does?
Yeah, maybe not. No, I had a key job before I did this. I'm not going to go into here, but no, I'm not going to. But it was it was an unusual job,
Okay, sure.
put it this way. And it's one I was not really suited to either, but so I was glad to leave it about a year and a half ago.
Okay.
But I did that for 7 years, and I learned some interesting lessons, which I've deployed on Blogging Theology. It was a private company, and about how to understand corporately how the one's behavior in a corporate context. So I had to be very aware of the reputation of the company I work for, protecting it. I mean, regardless of whether or not I like the company, I was supposed to, and behave in certain ways, and be aware of how the reputation of the company affects its performance, blah blah blah, and and that awareness has had a substantial influence on what I do now. So, I really avoid ad hominems. I avoid attacking people publicly. I mean, it's wrong anyway, but I don't get into verbal warfares with people. I don't do videos that denounce other people like some people do. All this is completely off. I can't do that because it would damage the brand, so to speak. So I've learned some lessons from my previous experience, and also how to relate to a whole range of people in a professional way, hopefully, in terms of etiquette, the language you use, both in emails, correspondences, and verbally. So it's like a dab, but it's a dab that has been influenced by the best practice in the business world that I experienced. And I had to learn those lessons the hard way because I made mistakes before. Sometimes people would think my bluntness was rudeness, and it probably was. I had to learn how to phrase things in a way which is not going to trigger, cause offense. And that's been a difficult process to learn, given my own faults. So I have learned things from my previous work, but in terms of what it actually was, I'm not going to go there. But I wasn't suited to it either. But I did it because of the job.
Okay, sure.
Then,
how do you view? I know you asked this to Brother Roshan, I think his name is, the journalist, and he had a very somewhat pessimistic view. How would you describe the future of Islam in the UK? And I'll preface that by just adding this, because myself, when I think of staying in this country, I think now we live in this, people say the globalized village and whatnot, global village. I think it's very attractive for me to plan and prepare by the will of Allah to move out. As in, I think there's going to be a lot of Muslims who are passionate Muslims that they're going to think the best deal on offer to me is just to move to a country where it's easier. What's your thinking on that topic of the future of Islam in the UK and where you see things headed?
Well, it's funny you should say that because I've invited an academic, Professor Linda Woodhead. She's a professor at King's College here in London, a very prestigious sociologist of religion, to talk about this subject. Well, an aspect of this subject. She's done a lot of research on this, high-level research. She gave a lecture several weeks ago. That's how I even knew about her talking about this subject, which I watched on YouTube. And she said some very interesting things. I think she probably comes from a kind of, I don't know, but I suspect she comes from kind of an Anglican Christian background. I could be wrong, but that's my impression. She's certainly not a Muslim. It's Professor Linda Woodhead. And what she says is very interesting. And I think this is part of the answer to, she'll come on, God willing, beginning of December after this particular academic term has concluded. She's very busy doing that, she says, which is obviously very understandable. She says that she's looking at the recent census of the population, which is due to be published soon. She's done a lot of her own research in Britain about religious groups, religious adherence, attendance at churches and mosques and synagogues and whatnot, unbelief, people who practice witchcraft and magic and the occult, because they're on the rise, pagans, they call themselves pagans. That's big increase. And what she says is very interesting. It kind of rings true from my own personal individual experience. The overall religion in this country is in decline badly. I mean, it really is going down. The attendance at churches, whether it be Catholic or even evangelical or Church of England, is in free fall. And if you look at the statistics from over a decade ago compared to recent published statistics, there's a massive decline, with one exception. And the exception is Muslims and Islam, where the opposite is happening. And she said in one point in the lecture that to be religious, to be Christian in this country is not cool. Those are her words. It's not cool to be Christian. But it is cool, she says, to be a Muslim. I mean, if you're a young person, this is what she is. If you're a young person and you're a Muslim, it's cool. It's not like, oh my God, how can you be this boring? Well, really, you're a Muslim. It's kind of, it creates a little bit of a, it's interesting. You get a reaction. But who cares if you're Christian? It's like not interesting. And it is the case, I think, and I know some multiple sources, that Muslims in Britain are overwhelmingly, and certainly I've experienced this, have held on to the traditional conservative understanding of their faith, and young people as well. I mean, when I went to Juma on yesterday, to a mosque in Shepherd's Bush, and it's a Salafi mosque. It's where Shamsi goes. In fact, he gave the khutbah actually, and it's in a really not a very pleasant part of the market. It's where there's refuse outside. I mean, it's not the mosque's fault, by the way, to stress this. It's the people who manage the Shepherd's Bush market. But the whole area it's in, the media area, is not pleasant. And I'm being polite. And you go into the mosque, and it's clean in the mosque, of course. But it's not Regent's Park Mosque. It hasn't got a big chandelier. It's not glamorous. It doesn't have trustees who are the ambassadors of the Muslim nations like Regent's Park Mosque does.
Okay.
All the trustees of the mosque are all the ambassadors from all the Muslim countries on the planet. They're the management committee of Regent's Park Mosque. I kid you not. This mosque is not like that, but it is packed. I mean, it's really. I mean, when we were praying, it was like we were really squeezed. And it's full of mainly young people, younger guys, I would say 20s and 30s, perhaps. And, you choose to go to a place where you wouldn't want to hang around very much because it's not, for the reasons I mentioned. But the point is, if you go to the church down the road, and I know which building it is, it's never open. Apparently, very, very few people go there, I'm told by someone who knows. And this is like a snapshot of what's going on here, that Islam is attracting young people. They're solid and orthodox in their faith. Christianity is, unfortunately, I say unfortunately, I really want Christianity to be strong in Britain as a counterbalance to the forces of secularism and kufr and so on. It is the opposite. So the only success story is actually Islam in Britain. And this is something to be happy about. It's something to be excited about. It's a good news story. I know there's so many bad news stories around, and whether it be Islamophobia, discrimination, all that, of course, is real and terrible. But there is actually an amazing good news story here, is that Islam is robust and strong in Britain, I think, in terms of the adherence and the enthusiasm and the commitment of generations of particularly new, younger people now who will go to places which you wouldn't really want to go to because the area is not very nice. But they go there every Friday, and they listen, and they're serious about their faith. And they really are committed. And this is amazing. This is an amazing success story in secular terms, if you like, about a religious group in Britain, which is not found anywhere else. It's just not. So the issue of hijrah, which you touched on, is something else. And I'm not saying people shouldn't do hijrah or should do hijrah. I don't know the answer to that. Do we want to go to Malaysia or Indonesia? Yeah, it's a much more friendly context. But it's on the other side of the world. And, we're not Indonesian. I'm not Malaysian. You're not, there's more to it than just Islam there. It's about the culture, the language, the food, the temp, the climate, it's much more to it than just doing, oh, well, my kids are going to be taught decent values. Yeah, they might be. But what about the hospitals, the state of the hospitals? What about, these are issues as well. It's complicated. I don't have answers, unfortunately. But there is a good news story about Muslims in Britain, according to Linda Woodward's research, and that is, it seems to be the single success story that is bucking the trend of other religious decline. Whether or not Muslims also will succumb to decline, I suspect they won't. I think there's something about Islam which just retains a powerful belief, actually. And even those who leave the faith, because there are some who do, are replaced by those who come in. So there seems to be, like in America, a lot of people leave Islam, particularly second, third generation youngsters, because there's huge pressure from society. But nevertheless, their numbers are more than adequately counterbalanced by people coming into the faith. So overall, the stats are holding up, I think, even in America.
Alhamdulillah, yeah.
What do you think?
I think from a second generation immigrant perspective, the story I always say is how my father came to the UK in the late 1960s, and that generation, they had their view initially was that they're just going to stay here for work and go back, right? So they never envisioned Islam having any serious footing here, and they would never have thought, if someone was to tell them in 50 years time there's going to be like masjids on every corner, let's say in certain communities, and they were making do by renting churches for Eid prayer and things like this. And I think part of that reason is that normally, you know how they say teenagers and people, generally young people, they have an identity crisis and whatnot. I think people who are like second generation immigrants, they're much more likely to attach themselves to the identity of being a Muslim rather than anything else. And I think that has something to do with it in terms of younger Muslims becoming more practicing and whatnot, because their primary identity of how they see themselves is, I'm a Muslim. I might have Pakistani heritage or whatever else, but that becomes their dominant kind of system of being, essentially. I think that's a good thing, but I don't know how that translates to further generations where they're coming with that system, so it's a bit different. It's a question for sociologists that I think your future guests will be better placed to address, and it'll be interesting to see.
Absolutely.
So it was a positive conclusion, I guess. Jazakallah khair. Thank you very much for coming on and giving us your time. And thank you.
My pleasure. Very much for coming on. I do appreciate what you do, and best wishes for what your channel and all the projects you're involved in. I think you're extremely very creative and very busy in producing content. So
Jazakallah khair. So assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Assalamu. Thank you. Take care.